Hello, dear listeners. Gather round, settle in, and get ready for a different kind of story tonight. Forget the dusty timelines and battle-scarred epics. Tonight, we're climbing somewhere a bit higher. Not to the realm of mortals, but to Mount Olympus itself, where the air is rich with ambrosia, the clouds carry gossip, and the gods? Well, let's just say they were a lot messier than their statues suggest. If this kind of storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's always something comforting about seeing others drift off to the same quiet mythology. So get comfortable, let the world settle around you, and let's begin with what the Olympian gods were really like. Let us begin, as all good stories ought to begin, with a mountain at dusk. Not just any mountain, mind you. Mount Olympus, the divine residence of the gods, where the clouds gather like courtly drapery, and the air smells faintly of ambrosia, and, perhaps on occasion, burnt offerings wafting up from the mortal world far below. It stands tall and regal on the northern frontier of ancient Greece, its summit so often hidden by mist that it seemed only natural to assume someone or something must be living up there. Probably something with really good aim for those offerings. In truth, Olympus is a very real mountain, the highest in Greece actually, rising to just under 10,000 feet. But, to the ancient Greeks, it wasn't merely a collection of rocks and ridges. No, it was sacred geography. It was the celestial seat of power, draped in ever-changing light and ever-watchful silence. They saw it not as something to be climbed, unless you were a particularly ambitious demigod with a death wish, but to be revered, a divine penthouse, if you like, with rather exclusive and often bickering tenants. And those tenants are, yes, the Olympians. 12 gods and goddesses, give or take a few, depending on which myth you believe and how generous you're feeling with seating arrangements. Together, they form the core of the ancient Greek pantheon, capricious, passionate, thunderous, petty, brilliant, and they were worshipped, feared, and occasionally gossiped about for centuries. Quite like celebrities, really, if celebrities could hurl lightning and turn people into olive trees. But before we meet them individually, let's linger a little on the setting, for it's twilight on Olympus, the hour when the golden light fades gently behind marble colonnades, and divine banquets are just beginning. Imagine wide halls gleaming with polished stone, lyres playing softly in the background, probably something soothing, not too much heavy metal, and long tables groaning with impossible fruits, cheeses aged by the winds of prophecy, and wine so potent it'd make a satyr weep with joy. This is no place of solemnity. Olympus in myth was vibrant, divine, occasionally chaotic, like a very large, dysfunctional family gathering with a healthy sprinkling of immortality and magical livestock. The kind of place where someone is always playing a harp, and someone else is always dramatically storming out, usually after a snide comment about their fashion choices. Now, if you're imagining marble floors and ionic columns, you're not entirely off base, but don't expect a neatly catalogued palace blueprint. The earliest Greek poets, Homer and Hesiod, speak of radiant halls and cloud gates, but they weren't exactly architectural draftsmen. What we're given is a suggestion of immense beauty, shimmering materials and eternal comfort, halls of bronze and gold, courtyards paved with sunlight, feasts that never end, and fountains that sing. It's less of a building and more of a heavenly ambiance, probably designed by a minimalist who really liked gold. And what's a good ambiance without a menu? You'll be pleased to know the gods dined rather well. Their diet consisted primarily of two things, ambrosia and nectar. Not to be confused with a posh London cafe, ambrosia was said to be the food of immortality. What it actually tasted like depends on the source. Some say honeyed bread, others a kind of fragrant perfume you absorb through your very essence, which frankly sounds more like skincare than a starter. Nectar, its liquid companion, flowed like sunlight in a chalice, served in cups of gold and kept everyone in a perpetually divine state of health, youth, and likely a mild buzz. The gods didn't age. They didn't get ill. They didn't suffer the usual indignities of mortal life, apart from emotional outbursts, which, if anything, they had in abundance. The divine lifestyle was not without its duties, however. Each god had a portfolio, so to speak. Zeus, for example, handled thunderstorms, law, and infidelity, a rather broad portfolio. Poseidon had dominion over the sea, earthquakes, and moody trident waving. Athena took care of wisdom, war strategy, and glowering from behind shields. Each Olympian had their domain, and while some took their roles seriously, others used them as an excuse to meddle in mortal affairs or skip staff meetings altogether. One might imagine that a day on Olympus involved quite a lot of sitting around looking powerful, which, to be fair, it probably did. But it also meant making decisions. Would a hero succeed in his quest? Would a city be blessed with rain or buried under ash? Would a mortal's prayer be answered or ignored? The gods were not bound by logic. They were divine, after all. And if they seemed inconsistent, well, that was rather the point. The world was unpredictable, and so were its rulers. From their cloud-wrapped thrones, the gods watched mortals go about their business with varying degrees of interest. They observed, they judged, they laughed, they wept occasionally, and sometimes they interfered, often dramatically. The line between gods and mortals, you see, was not quite so firm in ancient Greek thought. The gods were not distant deities, unreachable and abstract. They were near, familiar, emotionally turbulent. They could take human form, walk among us, fall in love, or lust more often, and produce heroes with a knack for slaying monsters and starting wars. Their children became demigods, whose lives were extraordinary but seldom long, usually ending in some tragic, heroic fashion. But Olympus itself was different. It was the place the gods returned to, a safe haven above the chaos of the world. Imagine, if you will, the moment after a storm, the clouds parting, a golden glow returning, and silence falling over the peaks. That was Olympus, not a realm of perfection, but of divine pause, the only real constant in a world where nothing else lasted. Now, about the company kept on this mountaintop. We often refer to the 12 Olympians, but the list wasn't entirely fixed. It usually included Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Hephaestus, Aphrodite, Hermes, and either Dionysus or Hestia. Poor Hestia was occasionally bumped from the guest list, despite being the goddess of the hearth. One assumes she didn't mind. She always struck me as someone who preferred a quiet evening by the fire to a thunderbolt measuring contest between brothers. Each god brought something unique to the table. Apollo, radiant and polished, never without his lyre or a cryptic prophecy. Artemis, watchful and swift, ever elusive beneath the trees. Ares, brawny and brash, the kind of guest who eats all the olives and breaks the furniture. Aphrodite, all soft glances and dangerously persuasive silences. And Hermes, that wily trickster with a grin that said he'd already stolen your sandals and perhaps your car keys. They were gods, yes, but unmistakably human in spirit. That was the genius of Greek mythology. Its divinities reflected us in all our glittering flaws. The Greeks built temples to honor them. Yes, magnificent columns rising toward the sky, sanctuaries thick with incense and prayer. But they also told stories. Myths passed from lips to ears, campfires to amphitheatres. Stories of love, betrayal, pride, revenge. Stories that taught, warned, entertained. Olympus was not just a place above the clouds. It was a theatre stage, a family drama, a mirror of the human soul raised to cosmic scale. And what of the mortals who gazed up toward the summit? They knew they would never see its peak. Olympus was shrouded not just in clouds, but in mystery. No human was meant to reach it. Not really. Those who tried, like the Titan Atlas who bore the sky on his back, often paid dearly for their ambition. Olympus was a place of dreams. It was not for climbing, it was for imagining. And imagine it they did. The poets especially, Homer, in his Iliad and Odyssey, filled Olympus with radiant halls and divine disputes. Hesiod gave it grandeur, genealogy, structure. Later playwrights gave it irony. Philosophers gave it doubt. But always, Olympus remained serene, glowing gently, aloof. Today, the mountain still stands. People hike it now, of course, in sturdy boots with trail mix and GPS. They reach the summit, and see the land stretch far in all directions, the Aegean in the distance, fields below like faded mosaics. But they do not find temples, only wind and sky, and the sense of something ancient watching quietly. The gods may not live there anymore, but their stories linger in the air, and perhaps as the sun sets over the crags and shadows pull like old wine, one might close their eyes and hear faintly the sound of laughter carried on the breeze. A harp, a voice, a divine footstep, something not entirely gone. So let us leave Olympus now, with a gentle step and a quiet heart. The gods are at their table, the torches are lit, and the stars have begun to shimmer above their golden halls. Sleep well, traveller. You're in good company now. We begin tonight with the sound of distant thunder. Not the kind that announces a storm, mind you. No, this one rolls in slow and steady like a drum beat from the heavens, accompanied by a flicker of lightning that's more theatrical than threatening. You see, when Zeus makes an entrance, he does enjoy a bit of atmosphere. Zeus, king of the gods, ruler of Olympus, lord of thunder, rain, and the celestial order, and incidentally, one of the most complicated family men in all of mythology, which, considering his company, is really saying something. But let's not start with his scandals just yet. First, let us imagine him as the Greeks once did, seated high on his throne atop Olympus, robed in flowing white and gold, a scepter in one hand, a thunderbolt in the other, and an expression that oscillates somewhere between stern authority and amused distraction. Around him, the air hums with power. He is not just a king, he is the very embodiment of law, order, and cosmic balance, most of the time. Zeus did not inherit Olympus by luck. His story begins in the deep past, long before there were temples, poets, or polite prayers. Born to the Titans, Cronus and Rhea, yes, that same Cronus, who had a rather troubling habit of swallowing his children whole, Zeus was the youngest of 6 children, and the only one not immediately swallowed at birth. Yes, swallowed. Cronus, their father, had a nasty habit of eating his offspring to avoid being overthrown. It's the sort of parenting style that usually lands one on a watch list at a very young age. But Rhea, the clever mother that she was, spirited baby Zeus away, and tricked Cronus with a swaddled rock, which he rather embarrassingly swallowed whole. Meanwhile, Zeus grew up hidden in a cave on the island of Crete, raised by nymphs, suckled by a magical goat, and protected by divine warriors who clashed their spears to muffle his cries. A rather noisy nursery, but effective nonetheless. When Zeus came of age, he did what any ambitious son of prophecy might do. He returned, tricked Cronus into disgorging his siblings, and led a divine rebellion known as the Titanomachy. For 10 years, the younger gods, the Olympians, battled the old order, until Zeus hurled the final thunderbolt and sealed their victory. The Titans were cast into Tartarus, a sort of godly oubliette, and Olympus was claimed. This then was how Zeus became king, not by birthright but by cleverness, courage, and, it must be said, a knack for dramatic timing. As king, Zeus wasn't merely a figurehead. He governed the skies, yes, but also oaths, hospitality, and justice. If someone broke a sacred promise, it was Zeus they feared. If a stranger arrived at your door, you offered them food and drink in Zeus's name. He was in many ways the god of social glue, the one who held things together, even if his own household was often teetering on the brink of utter chaos. Now, if you'll forgive a brief aside, no discussion of Zeus is complete without addressing the, shall we say, romantic entanglements. Zeus, it must be admitted, had a wandering eye and foot and the occasional animal disguise. His liaisons with mortal women and quite a few goddesses form a veritable catalogue of ancient myths. Sometimes he approached them in the form of a handsome man, other times as a swan, a bull, a shower of golden light. Whatever works, I suppose. These unions produced many of the great heroes of Greek mythology: Heracles, Perseus, Helen of Troy, Minos, and so on. Each was born of a different woman, each destined for a different path, and each a small stitch in the grand tapestry of Zeus's legacy, though perhaps not the sort of legacy Hera, his wife, had in mind. Oh yes, Hera, queen of the gods, goddess of marriage, and long-suffering spouse of the most prolific philanderer in Olympus. Their marriage, as immortal as it was, would not be described as tranquil. Hera was dignified, intelligent, and ferociously proud. Zeus, for his part, loved her in his own way, but that didn't stop him from repeatedly testing the limits of her patience. If you've ever attended a family dinner where no one mentions the elephant in the room, and then Zeus turns into that elephant, well, you begin to get the idea. Their quarrels were the stuff of legend. Sometimes Hera would attempt to outwit or even overthrow her husband. Once, she orchestrated a rebellion among the Olympians, and Zeus had to be rescued by a 100-armed giant named Briareus. Another time, he suspended her from the sky by golden chains as punishment. Not his finest moment, to be sure, but always they reconciled, or at least reached a détente. Immortality is a long time, after all. One does get used to things. Yet Zeus's story is not all mischief and lightning. He was also the arbiter of cosmic balance. When mortals committed crimes or acted with hubris, that dangerous blend of arrogance and defiance, it was Zeus who issued judgment. He sent omens, he dispatched the Furies, he struck down the proud, but he also rewarded virtue. He upheld the sacred bonds of guest and host, and he listened to prayer. The Greeks saw him as the great anchor of divine authority. His image adorned temples, coins, and statues across the ancient world. In Olympia, a colossal gold and ivory statue of Zeus sat within the grand temple, crafted by the sculptor Phidias and counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. He was not merely a myth, he was a cultural cornerstone. And yet, there's something very human about him, isn't there? For all his thunderbolts and grandeur, Zeus often behaved like an exasperated father, trying to keep a house full of eccentric children from setting the curtains on fire. He meddled in Trojan politics. He weighed the fates of heroes in battle. He tried, often in vain, to maintain order on Olympus. It was a divine soap opera, and Zeus was both director and reluctant lead. He could be merciful, forgiving Prometheus, for instance, after centuries of punishment for stealing fire for mankind. And he could be vengeful, as when he flooded the earth to cleanse it of human wickedness. But above all, Zeus was consistent in one regard. He reminded mortals of the limits of their reach. In the myths, those who challenged him, whether giants or kings, almost always fell. Not because Zeus hated them necessarily, but because the natural order had to be preserved. And order was what Zeus valued most. In the post-Titan world, the universe was no longer chaos and darkness. It had rhythms, seasons, laws. The stars wheeled in the sky, the rains came and went, cities rose and fell, but the heavens endured, and somewhere high above Zeus watched it all. Now, it's easy to imagine him as simply a tyrant with a thunderbolt, but I prefer to think of him as something more complex, a divine figure who carried the weight of the world's unpredictability on his shoulders, one who stood between the realm of mortals and the unknown beyond, one who roared and wept and raged, not because he was cruel, but because the world was full of choices and none of them were ever simple. Even the gods had their burdens. So when we picture him, let it be not only with power in his gaze, but with weariness behind it. For though he was the king, his rule was never quiet. There was always a new hero to watch, a new war to judge, a new prophecy to ponder. And all the while the wind shifted, the clouds gathered, and somewhere down below a poet whispered his name. Tonight the thunder is distant, the skies are calm. Zeus reclines in his hall, the firelight glinting off his crown, and the world, for the moment, is at peace. The stars blink overhead like ancient eyes, and the mountain breathes its slow, eternal rhythm. Sleep now. You are under the watchful gaze of the King of Olympus, and he is feeling merciful tonight. Settle in now. The lamps are low, the fire is quiet, and tonight we turn our attention to Hera, Queen of the Gods. You've already met her husband Zeus in all his thunder-tossing, shape-shifting glory. But Hera is something quite different. Not a ruler of the skies, not a wielder of storms or prophecies, but the quiet and steady heart of Olympus, and on more than one occasion the source of a sharp look that could turn a lesser deity into stone, or at the very least send them scuttling off to a minor temple in Thessaly. She was, and remains, the goddess of marriage, of women, of childbirth, and of regal dignity. But Hera is not merely domestic. She is not gentle in the way springtime is gentle. She is fierce, enduring, intelligent, and more than capable of making her displeasure known, particularly when it concerns the many, many indiscretions of her husband. But we'll get to that in good time. First, let us begin at the beginning. At her birth, long before Olympus was even built, Hera was born to the Titans Cronus and Rhea. Yes, that same Cronus, who had a rather troubling habit of swallowing his children whole. Hera, like her siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hades, and Poseidon, vanished into the belly of her father until Zeus, the youngest and savviest of the lot, rescued them all. One does not typically think of rebirth as an act of digestion, but mythology rarely bothers with subtlety. When Zeus freed his siblings and overthrew the old order, Hera emerged into the world anew. Though younger than her brother husband, yes, mythology is like that, she quickly established herself not just as his consort, but as his equal in divine authority. She was not merely Zeus's wife. She was the queen of Olympus, crowned in her own right, probably with a perpetually unimpressed expression. And how did they meet? Well, Zeus naturally pursued her with all the subtlety of a lightning storm, but Hera, clever and cautious, was not so easily impressed. She resisted his advances, holding him at bay until he employed one of his more peculiar courtship strategies, disguising himself as a helpless cuckoo bird. He flung himself into her lap, trembling and pitiful. Touched by pity, she cradled the bird, at which point he transformed back into himself and in classic divine fashion took her by surprise. It's not exactly romantic by modern standards, but in the mythological world it was practically a sonnet. Their marriage, however, was far from idyllic. Hera, the goddess of marriage itself, found herself bound to a husband whose fidelity was about as stable as a chariot with one wheel. Zeus's dalliances with mortal women, nymphs, and even other goddesses became the stuff of legend and tragedy. Each time he strayed, Hera's response was not silence or resignation. It was vengeance, measured, precise, and often deeply poetic. But let us be fair, Hera's anger wasn't blind rage. It was rooted in dignity, in a deep sense of what was proper, sacred, and just. She did not lash out without cause. When she punished, she did so with the calm certainty of a queen upholding order in a realm that seemed determined to unravel. Consider, for instance, the tale of Io, a mortal priestess whom Zeus fancied. When Hera came sniffing around, Zeus panicked and turned Io into a white cow. Hera, of course, saw right through this bovine charade. She accepted the cow as a gift, ever so graciously, and appointed Argus, a giant with 100 eyes, to guard her. Not the subtlest move, but effective. Zeus, desperate, sent Hermes to lull Argus to sleep with stories and music. And once all 100 eyes had closed, Hermes dispatched him. Hera was furious. She retrieved the cowgirl Io and placed Argus's many eyes onto the tail of her sacred bird, the peacock, a detail that endures in the bird's plumage to this day. That's the thing about Hera, she didn't forget. She memorialized. She took insults and carved them into the stars, into feathers, into stone, not out of spite, but out of principle. Her world was order, and when it was disrupted, she responded accordingly. Another tale, this one involving Heracles, one of Zeus's many sons by another woman. Hera hated him from the moment he drew breath. She sent serpents into his cradle. She drove him to madness. She placed obstacles in his path at every turn. And yet, in an irony almost too perfect, it was Heracles, after his death, who was welcomed into Olympus and reconciled with Hera, even marrying her daughter Hebe. One imagines the family dinners were exquisitely tense, filled with polite smiles and simmering resentment. But Hera was not merely an angry wife. That's a simplification, and an unfair one. She was the goddess to whom women prayed for safe childbirth, for a stable home, for the sacred bond of marriage to hold firm. She was protector and patroness of queens. Her temples were among the most splendid in Greece, particularly the great Heraion near Argos, where priestesses performed elaborate rituals and dedicated their lives to her service. She was also the embodiment of regal poise. When Homer describes her in the Iliad, it's with a kind of awed reverence, tall, proud, golden-eyed. She rides in a chariot pulled by peacocks, wears a crown that gleams with the fire of heaven, and speaks with a voice that can silence a room full of immortals. Even Zeus, for all his bluster, knew when to tread carefully around Hera. Their marriage, for all its strife, was also a political bond, a symbol of cosmic balance, Zeus representing raw power and law, and Hera representing loyalty, structure, and sacred tradition. Together, they ruled not just Olympus, but the framework of the Greek cosmos. Their quarrels were myth, yes, but they also reflected the eternal struggle between freedom and fidelity, chaos and order, impulse and restraint. To worship her was not to adore gentleness. It was to honor strength wrapped in dignity. It was to recognize that the world needs not just storms, but boundaries. That love is not always sweet. Sometimes it is fierce, wounded, enduring. Sometimes it clenches its jaw and carries on for the sake of something larger than the self. She had moments of compassion too. She aided Jason and the Argonauts. She watched over women in labor. She lent power to those who upheld justice. In some myths, she is a maternal figure, not soft, but solid. The kind of mother who might not kiss your scrapes, but who would stand between you and a charging bull without flinching. In art, she is nearly always majestic, seated on a throne, a scepter in one hand, a lotus-tipped staff or a pomegranate in the other. The pomegranate, as you might recall, being a symbol of fertility and the cycle of life, one that appears frequently in ancient depictions of divine queenship. Her sacred animals beyond the peacock include the cow, not merely for its docility, but for its association with nurturing and steadfastness. There's a reason the Romans called her Juno and made her the chief goddess of their pantheon. Hera's archetype, the divine matron, both feared and revered, echoes across countless cultures. She is not a goddess who fades with time. She is one who endures it. And so we imagine her now, seated in her radiant hall high above the clouds, the golden light of Olympus falling across her brow. The peacocks shuffle softly at her feet, probably preening. The fires crackle low. A divine scroll rests beside her. Perhaps a new list of grievances or a wedding invitation or both. The gods around her quarrel and bicker, laugh and sulk, but Hera remains still watchful. She does not always speak first, but when she does, Olympus listens. Tonight, her gaze is calm. Her court is quiet. Somewhere in the mortal world, a marriage is made, a child is born, a vow is kept, and the Queen of the Heavens, for once, is at peace. Sleep now, traveller. You rest beneath her watchful eyes, and she never forgets. The sea, even now, holds a kind of ancient silence, a deep, breathing presence beneath the surface, never quite still, never fully asleep. And in that timeless blue, long before sailors traced constellations or merchants dreamed of distant shores, the Greeks believed something older stirred, something powerful, proud, and on occasion rather moody. Poseidon, brother to Zeus and Hades, god of the sea, earthquakes, horses, and quite notably grudges. While Zeus ruled the skies and Hades reigned below, Poseidon claimed everything that foamed, surged, churned, and crashed. The sea, after all, was not merely water to the ancient Greeks. It was a force, a frontier, a mystery. And Poseidon was its sovereign, ruling with all the subtle grace of a tidal wave. Imagine him now, tall, muscular, bearded like a storm-beaten king, hair tangled with salt and seaweed, his trident gleaming with the wet glint of dawn tides. He does not float above the clouds like his brother. He rides the crests of waves, pulled by hippocamps, those mythical seahorses with hooves of foam and manes like river reeds. When he speaks, it's with the low rumble of tectonic plates shifting beneath your feet. He is the voice of the ocean floor, old, rumbling, and not particularly patient. His realm is vast, not only the sea itself, but every inlet, spring, and underground stream. Sailors prayed to him before journeys. fishermen whispered his name over their nets. Even those on dry land, far from the coast, feared his wrath. Earthquakes, which the Greeks called Poseidon shaking the ground, were seen as his doing. You may recall, he's not the type to knock politely when displeased. Like his brothers, Poseidon's origin begins in darkness, swallowed like the rest of his siblings by Cronus, then freed by Zeus. After the Titanomachy, the war against the old gods, the world was divided. Zeus took the sky, Hades took the underworld, Poseidon was given the sea. Not as a consolation prize, mind you, but as a dominion equal in majesty and terror, and to be fair, it rather suited him. Poseidon's nature was not, shall we say, consistent. Some days he was beneficent, the god who granted calm winds, guided ships safely home, and coaxed fresh water from dry earth. Other times, not so much. He could whip the sea into a frenzy, send monstrous waves toward unsuspecting shores, and summon sea beasts large enough to snack on entire cities. He was not cruel, simply temperamental. The sea, after all, is both giver and taker, and so was he. One of his more famous tempers was directed at a city we now know as Athens. You see, Poseidon and his niece Athena both wished to become its patron deity. The gods proposed a contest. Each would present a gift, and the people would choose which god to honour. Poseidon struck the earth with his trident and produced a spring, though awkwardly it was salt water, which isn't terribly helpful in landlocked areas. Athena, meanwhile, offered the olive tree, a symbol of peace, prosperity, and rather useful for cooking and lamps. The Athenians, ever practical, chose her. Poseidon, in classic form, did not take the loss well. He flooded parts of the land in retaliation, probably muttering about ungrateful mortals, and though things eventually settled, it was clear losing was not something he tolerated gracefully. His relationships, like his tempers, were turbulent. He married a sea goddess named Amphitrite, one of the 50 Nereids. She initially fled his courtship, which involved a fair bit of chasing and the help of a dolphin. Yes, really, a dolphin convinced her. But eventually she relented, and they settled into what was, by Olympian standards, a relatively stable marriage. Their son Triton was half man, half fish, and often depicted blowing a conch shell to calm or summon the waves. That said, Poseidon was not the most faithful of husbands. His list of lovers and offspring rivals that of Zeus, and includes mortals, nymphs, and even creatures of his own making. His most famous children include the winged horse Pegasus, born from Medusa's severed neck, after Poseidon rather undiplomatically had pursued her in Athena's temple. There's also Polyphemus the Cyclops, who rather famously got on the wrong side of Odysseus, but more on that later. Poseidon's power was vast, but it was not always respected, especially by heroes who ought to have known better. Take Odysseus, for example. After blinding Polyphemus during his long journey home from Troy, he made the fatal error of taunting the Cyclops, whose father, of course, was Poseidon. This turned what should have been a 10-day voyage into a 10-year epic filled with shipwrecks, sirens, and sulking gods. The lesson: never anger the man who controls your travel plans, especially if he's prone to holding grudges. Yet Poseidon was also a builder. He helped construct the walls of Troy. Though when the king refused to pay him properly, Poseidon ensured the city would one day fall. Again, we return to the theme of divine memory. The Olympians, especially Poseidon, had long memories and an even longer sense of justice when they felt slighted. Worship of Poseidon was widespread in coastal regions. The Isthmus of Corinth housed one of his major temples, a grand structure where sailors and seagoers offered sacrifices for safe passage. Horses were sacred to him, not just seahorses, but earthly ones too. He was said to have created the first horse, striking the earth with his trident. In some myths, he's even credited with teaching humanity how to harness their strength. A reminder that Poseidon, though wild, could be generous when honoured properly. But the sea is not merely geography. To the Greeks it was a living presence. It connected lands, carried myths, swallowed empires, and Poseidon was its voice, never entirely predictable but always aware. His temples stood open to the wind. His statues looked outward toward the horizon. The sea was his, and so was the space between. He was also deeply involved in the origin stories of many islands. Greek mythology is filled with accounts of Poseidon raising lands from the sea or smashing them in fits of pique. The island of Delos, sacred to Apollo and Artemis, was said to have once floated freely across the Aegean until Poseidon anchored it in place. There were times too when he struck land into being, new shores rising in tribute to his power. In festivals, Poseidon's worshippers did not always offer their prayers in gentle tones. Sacrifices were often made with a mix of fear and reverence. At some coastal sites, entire horses were driven into the sea as offerings, not out of cruelty, but because Poseidon's hunger was thought to match the size of his domain. He was not a half-god, not a tender god. He was primal, elemental. Even the Romans, who called him Neptune, retained this vision of a forceful, ocean-bound deity. His image persisted through empires, carved into stone, etched into coins, guiding ships long after belief in him had faded. The sea, after all, does not forget its god so easily. We imagine him now, in his underwater palace made of coral and pearl, the walls shimmering with light, filtered through leagues of ocean. Sea nymphs glide past like shadows. Triton's conch echoes faintly through distant caverns. Poseidon himself sits upon a throne of stone and shell, gazing out across his domain. Silent, but not still, never still. He does not speak often, but when he does, the waters respond. Perhaps he watches the mortals sailing above, their sails full of borrowed wind, their ships no more than fragile bones upon the deep. Perhaps he lets them pass, or perhaps he sends a gentle ripple, just a reminder that he is there. Not cruel, this god, but not forgetful. He embodies the sea, vast, mercurial, essential, a god of storms and silences alike. And for the Greeks, he was not to be loved blindly, but respected absolutely. So tonight, as you drift toward dreams, let the rhythm of waves soothe your mind. The ocean has its stories, old and echoing, and far beneath Poseidon rests, not sleeping, but listening. Sleep well now. The sea is calm tonight, and he allows it. And now, as the celestial spotlight shifts, let's descend a little from the boisterous halls of Olympus and dive into a realm often misunderstood, a place of shadows, secrets, and surprisingly well-organized bureaucracy, the underworld. Ruled not by a fiery devil, but by a quiet, often overlooked god named Hades. He's the eldest brother of Zeus and Poseidon, and while his siblings got the glitzy realms of sky and sea, Hades drew the short straw, winning dominion over the dead and everything beneath the earth. Talk about a raw deal in the cosmic lottery. Imagine Hades now, not a menacing figure with horns and a pitchfork, but a solemn, dignified king. He's usually depicted with dark hair and a beard, often seated on a throne of ebony, sometimes holding a scepter or a key, symbolizing his absolute control over the realm of the dead. His expression is typically unsmiling, but not unkind, more like a perpetually overworked CEO of a very large, perpetually expanding enterprise. His crown might be made of cypress or narcissus, plants associated with death and the underworld, and by his side, almost always, is his three-headed dog, Cerberus, a loyal if slightly drool-prone guardian. Hades' origin story, like his brothers, begins with being swallowed by Cronus and later regurgitated. After the Titanomachy, when the universe was divided, Hades claimed the underworld, a vast and complex domain. This wasn't just a grim basement, it was a layered realm. There was the Elysian Fields, a paradise for heroes and the virtuous, Asphodel Meadows, a neutral zone for ordinary souls, and Tartarus, the deepest, darkest pit for the truly wicked and the imprisoned titans. So, imagine a sophisticated spiritual sorting system, complete with different climate zones. Unlike many of the other Olympians, Hades wasn't one for casual visits to the mortal world. He was a stay-at-home god, meticulous and reclusive. His job was to ensure that the dead stayed dead, and that the cosmic balance between life and death was maintained. He rarely involved himself in the squabbles of the living, preferring to focus on his administrative duties, keeping track of souls, overseeing the rivers that separated the living from the dead, like the gloomy Styx, and making sure Charon, the ferryman, was properly paid. You could say he was the original civil servant, just with more dead people. Now, for his most famous story, and perhaps his only notable venture into the upper world, the abduction of Persephone. She was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and absolutely adored by her mother. One day, while Persephone was picking flowers, Hades, struck by her beauty, burst forth from a chasm in his chariot, swept her away, and took her to be his queen in the underworld. It sounds rather unromantic, perhaps even a bit aggressive by modern standards. But in the ancient world, it was often seen as a legitimate, if abrupt, form of marriage. Demeter, however, was not pleased. Her grief caused a terrible famine on Earth, forcing Zeus to intervene. A compromise was reached. Persephone would spend part of the year with Hades as his queen, and part of the year with her mother, bringing forth the seasons. So, next time you complain about winter, blame Hades' love life. Despite this dramatic beginning, Hades and Persephone's marriage was, by all accounts, quite stable and loving. Persephone, though initially reluctant, grew to appreciate her role as queen of the dead, ruling alongside her husband. She was a powerful force in the underworld, often more approachable than Hades himself, acting as a compassionate intermediary for desperate souls. Their relationship highlights a different side of Hades, a god capable of deep affection and loyalty, a stark contrast to Zeus's philandering ways. In fact, Hades is one of the few Greek gods who isn't plagued by a laundry list of extramarital affairs. Perhaps the dating scene in the underworld just isn't that great, or maybe he was genuinely devoted. We'll go with devoted. Hades was also associated with the Earth's hidden riches, precious metals, gems, and the fertile soil itself, which supported life and crops. Because of this, he was sometimes invoked as Pluton, meaning the rich one, giving us the name Pluto. So, while he ruled over death, he also represented the unseen wealth and bounty beneath the surface. He wasn't all gloom and doom. He had a diversified portfolio. Mortals rarely worshipped Hades directly. His name was often feared, and people preferred to avoid speaking it, using euphemisms instead, like the Unseen One or the Hospitable One. Hospitable because he always had room for new arrivals. Temples dedicated to him were rare and often built underground or in caves. Sacrifices to Hades were typically performed in pits, with blood poured into the earth to reach him. It was a more somber, respectful kind of worship, acknowledging the inevitable finality he represented. Unlike the other gods, Hades wasn't prone to petty meddling in mortal affairs unless someone truly crossed a line, like trying to cheat death. Sisyphus, for instance, famously chained up Thanatos, death itself, causing no one to die, which really messed up Hades' schedule. Hades swiftly put an end to that nonsense. He was a stickler for rules, especially the ultimate rule of life and death. So, when we picture Hades, let's not think of him as evil, but as essential. He is the guardian of boundaries, the silent keeper of the balance. Without him, the world would be an overpopulated mess, and immortality would lose its meaning. He's the unsung hero of the cosmos, quietly doing the vital, if somewhat depressing, work no one else wants. He's the kind of guy who probably secretly enjoys a quiet evening in, sorting through scrolls of the newly departed, occasionally patting Cerberus, and making sure the eternal fires aren't getting too rambunctious. Tonight, as the night deepens and the world grows still, remember Hades. He is down there, diligently maintaining order, ensuring that every soul finds its proper place. The shadows are long, the earth sleeps, and the king of the underworld keeps watch. Sleep well now. His gaze is on the balance, and for tonight, all is in order.